Okay, so we just sewed a 1/4 inch seam allowance right there and right there on both sets. So you should have a U with pretty side up and pretty side down. Make sure that you've overlapped those a 1/4 inch. The reason being is so that when we fold it up like this, it actually has a relatively straight edge right there. So once we've done that, we're going to come over to the ironing board. Pressing is going to be essential with this project. What we want to do is we want to press those seams open. So we're going to line it up right here, and we're going to use the tip of the iron, and we're just going to slide across, just like that. And we're going to press the seam open. So we're starting on the ugly side, pressing on the ugly side first, then we'll move over and press the pretty side. So we're pressing this seam. This is called pressing open. We want to get that seam exactly flat. We want our fabric to be split going opposite directions. Then we can turn it over and press this side. At this point, you can take a moment and press out any creases that may be in your fabric from the folds or just from working with the fabric. What you do to one side, you want to make sure you do to the other. We're starting on the ugly side. We're pulling those seams apart so that we can press this open. We want it to be a nice flat seam. The tie will be, the pieces, as we've pieced them together now, will be relatively straight. They won't be perfectly straight though. So this is where we've got to start working a little bit with our imaginations. So we're working our way across, pressing right there. Now we're ready to pin our pieces together. The tie pattern should match up relatively easily. So we've got 2 long strips now. One side is going to be our lining, one side is going to be the tie print. So if I'm looking at this, because I cut this out with both pieces at the same time, I've got one tie where my stripes are kind of going across, or horizontally across, and one tie where my stripes are going vertically. Decide which one's going to be your pretty side, which one's going to be your ugly side. I'm going to make this side, my stripes going horizontal, as my pretty side. So this is my pretty side, this is my lining. Either way, it doesn't really matter. We're putting them together. We're going to line up our points. We're putting pretty sides together, lining up our points, and we're just going to pin just where we're going to be sewing on the points, just that little V right there. So we're lining this up the best that we can, slipping pins in. As we sew this, once again, we are using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to start sewing. I'm going to make sure my needle is down. Make sure you backstitch when you start and stop. I'm going to put needle down. I'm going to sew, backstitch, sew. When I get to my point right here, I'm going to pivot. Needle's going to be down. I'm going to pivot and sew 1/4 inch right here, backstitch. What I do to this end, I'm going to do to that end. You're now ready to sew. Okay, so we just pinned right here and we sewed 1/4 inch seam allowance, pivoting right here at the point. What you do on one end, you do on the other end. So we're just doing just the tip right there, just the point. 1/4 inch seam allowance, pivoting right at the point. Make sure you backstitch when you start and stop. At this point, all of this right here is called seam allowance. The space from the seam to the edge is seam allowance. We want to reduce the amount of fabric that is going to be in our seam allowance right down here on the point so that when we turn this, it's got a nice sharp point. We want to just trim off just like a big V. We want to be very careful not to cut over the seam, otherwise you're going to have a hole right there. So just trim off, reduce the amount of seam allowance just right here at the point. What you do to one end, you do to the other. So we just want to reduce the amount of bulk that's going to be right on the inside. You do not want to get too close to the seam because we don't want there to be a hole there. So now we're heading to the ironing board. We're going to turn the points. We're just flipping it the opposite direction. You can use your finger, you can use the tip of your shears. to get that out to a nice strong point. See, this is not a nice strong point. That still has a very blunt edge right there. We want it to be a nice strong point. So you can use the tip of your shears just like this, pull it between the layers of fabric, and just use the tip of your shears to push that point out. That's one resource you have, because we want that to be a nice sharp point. Another resource is just to use the tip of a pin, and some people kind of struggle with this one, but you can use the pin and just stick it right through the edge of the fabric and just kind of pull on the seam just a little bit. So you've got a couple of options there. The whole point is to get our fabric so that this seam can be exactly on the edge, just like on the pillowcase or the apron project. We want to wiggle those seams back and forth so the seam is directly on the edge, and we're going to press. We're going to do the same thing with this other side, wiggle so that we get that seam allowance exactly lined up on the edge. We don't want to see the vertical stripes on this side, and we don't want to see the horizontal stripes on this side. So now what you do to one end, you do to the other. We're just going to flip so that pretty sides are showing. We're going to get that point out just as sharp as we can. This is the side of your tie that's actually going to be showing, the end of your tie rather. So this is the side that you really want to make sure you're doing a good job on. Wiggle that fabric back and forth until that seam is exactly on the edge. We don't want any fabric overlapping. Then we're going to press. We want that to be a nice sharp point. We're going to get that seam exactly on the edge, just exactly the way you did with your apron project, and press. Okay, now we're ready to come back over to our workstation. Once again, we have our tie with the vertical stripe. This side is my lining, and we've got our tie with the horizontal stripe. This side is my actual tie side. I want to make sure that I am lining up these pieces. Since this is my pretty side, this is the side that I want to show on my tie, this is going to be folded together with pretty sides together. I'm going to line up all 4 layers of these fabrics. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're going to line up all 4 of those edges. You do not want to miss any of those edges, because once again we are going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we want all of those to be in the seam. We're pinning approximately a hand widths apart, so we're folding this tie in half all the way across. Make sure that you're getting all 4 of those layers in your pinning. Sometimes it's a good idea to double check. This is one of the reasons why it's so important that we did a good job matching that up on the points, is so that as we line up now, we're getting a relatively straight tie. Working our way across, we want to make sure that these pieces, get my fingers a little bit grippy, are lining up as closely as possible. We're pinning all the way across. I'm going to start back down on this end and we'll meet in the middle. Getting through all 4 layers, we're pinning perpendicular to where we're going to be sewing, using that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Folding it in half. My lining side is showing. So my pretty sides, the tie that I want, the part of my tie that I want to actually be seen is on the inside. We're not seeing that spot right now. Now that I've got it pinned into place, I am going to sew right across here, all the way across, back stitching when I start and I stop, 1/4 inch seam allowance.